The burn scar that traced Elara Stoneforge's left cheekbone caught the first light of dawn as she pulled open the forge door and found 30 horses standing in her yard. She blinked. Certain exhaustion had conjured them. But no, they shifted and blew, real as iron, their hooves churning the frost-silvered mud. A lean man in a drover's coat stood at their head, holding a lead rope in one hand and his hat in the other. Mistress Stoneforge. His voice carried the rasp of someone who had ridden through the night. Name's Quinn Ironwood. I've got 30 post horses need shoeing before the mail run tomorrow. Your forge still working? Elara's gaze moved past him to the notice nailed to her door frame. The wax seal gleamed red even in the dim light. She had seen it when she stumbled to bed near midnight and had not yet found the courage to read it. "It's working," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, thick with the remnants of sleep and something heavier. She was an orc woman, green-skinned and strong-shouldered, with the small tusks of her kind just visible when she spoke. The burn scar pulled slightly when she frowned. 30 horses is a lot of work for one farrier. I know it. Quinn met her eyes without flinching, without the slight recoil she had grown accustomed to in the 2 years since Garrett died. I can pay coin up front, 2 silver per horse, 60 silver. Elara's heart kicked against her ribs. She forced herself to nod once, curt and professional, and stepped aside to let him bring the first animal to her anvil. She did not read the notice until the sun climbed high enough to slant through the forge door. Quinn had taken the horses to the paddock behind the smithy, rotating them in groups of 5 so she could work without being trampled. He moved among them with the easy confidence of someone who understood their language better than most people's. He did not try to make conversation. He simply brought each horse forward when she called for it, held the animal steady while she worked, and led it away when she finished. The notice said she had until the first frost to pay 300 silver, or the property would be seized to settle Garrett's debts. 300 silver. She had 42 in the leather pouch under her mattress, saved copper by copper over 2 winters of scraping by. The district brought her just enough work to keep the forge lit and food on her table, but never enough to climb out of the hole Garrett had left. He had been a good man, a kind husband who saw past green skin and tusks to the skill in her hands. But he had also been a man who borrowed to expand, who believed the future would be kinder than the past, and who died when a carriage horse shied and knocked a crucible of molten iron across them both. She had pulled him from the fire. The scar on her face was a small price for trying. It had not been enough. By the time the sun began to sink, she had shod 28 horses and her shoulders burned with a deep, bone-weary ache. Quinn brought the last 2 forward as she plunged a finished shoe into the slack tub. Steam hissed up between them. "You work fast," he said. "I work alone." She took the first hoof, bracing it against her leather apron, and began to clean it with her knife. "Fast is the only choice." He was silent for a moment, then, "Your husband was Garrett Stoneforge." It was not a question. She did not look up. "He was. I met him once. 3 years back, maybe 4. I was breaking a string of colts for the post service and one threw a shoe on the road. He rode out with his tools and fixed it right there in the ditch. Wouldn't take more than a copper for the trouble." Elara's hand stilled. She remembered that. Garrett had come home muddy and grinning, pleased with himself for the small kindness. She had scolded him for undercharging, and he had kissed the tip of her nose and told her some things were worth more than silver. "That sounds like him," she said quietly. Quinn nodded. He did not offer condolences or ask what happened. He simply held the horse steady while she finished the shoeing, and then the last one, and when she straightened and wiped the sweat from her brow, he counted 60 silver coins into her palm. "You did good work," he said. I'll be back in a fortnight. The route runs through here every 2 weeks, and there's always a horse or two needs tending. If you're willing." "I'm willing." He settled his hat back on his head and swung into the saddle of a sturdy bay. The other horses followed him in a long, jangling line, their new shoes bright against the dirt. Elara watched until they disappeared around the bend in the road, and then she went inside and added the silver to her pouch. 102 coins now, still not enough. Not nearly enough. The first frost was 8 weeks away. Quinn returned in 12 days, not 14, leading a gray mare with a cracked hoof and a swelling above the coronet band. Elara was in the yard, splitting kindling for the forge, and she paused with the axe in her hands as he dismounted. "Thought you said a fortnight," she said. "Mare couldn't wait that long." He ran a hand down the animal's leg and she picked up the hoof obediently, trust in every line of her posture. "Abscess, I think. Can you look?" Elara set the axe aside and came forward. She took the hoof in her hands, probing gently, and the mare flinched but did not pull away. "It's deep. I'll need to open it and pack it with a poultice. She'll need to stay off it for a few days. I can leave her here if you've got space." "I've got space." The old stable still had 2 stalls that were sound. She had kept it clean out of habit, though no one had boarded an animal with her since Garrett died. 3 silver for the work and a silver a day for feed. Done. He paid her and left the mare, and when he returned 3 days later, the abscess had drained and the swelling was down. Elara had wrapped the hoof in clean linen, and the mare walked sound. Quinn ran his hands over the animal's legs, checking her carefully, and then looked up at Elara with something like approval in his eyes. "You've got a good hand with them." "I've got a good hand with iron," she corrected. "Horses just happen to need it." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, brief and startling. "Fair enough." He came back the next week with a post horse that had thrown a shoe, the week after that with 2. By the end of the first month, he was bringing her all the work from his route horses that needed shoeing, horses with thrown shoes, a pony with an overgrown hoof that had begun to split. It was steady work, and the silver trickled into her pouch in a slow but reliable stream. She did not let herself hope, not yet, but the weight in her chest eased just enough to let her breathe. She learned things about him in those short visits. He lived in a room above the post stable in the next district, 20 miles down the valley. He had been a horse breaker before he became a rider, and before that, he had worked on his family's farm until his brothers inherited and there was no place left for him. He was 31, 4 years older than she was. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were plain and honest, without the false cheer or careful distance most humans used with her. She learned he took his tea black and sweet, and that he had a scar on his right forearm from a colt that had bitten him badly enough to leave a crescent of white tissue. She learned he always checked the horse's hooves himself before he left, not because he doubted her work but because it was his habit to be sure. And he learned things about her, though she did not mean to tell him. He learned she woke before dawn and worked past dark most days. He learned she kept the forge meticulously clean, every tool in its place, because disorder slowed her down, and she could not afford to be slow. He learned she had been apprenticed to a master farrier in the north, a human who had seen past her green skin to her steady hands, and that Garrett had been another apprentice in the same shop. They had worked side by side for 3 years before he asked her to marry him. "Did your family mind?" Quinn asked one afternoon. He was sitting on an overturned bucket near the forge, watching her shape a shoe for a chestnut gelding. The question was quiet, almost careful. "I don't have family." Elara turned the iron in the coals, watching the color shift from red to orange to yellow. "My mother died when I was young. I don't remember her. I was raised in a foundling house run by a temple. They apprenticed me out when I was old enough to be useful. And Garrett's family, her mouth twisted. They minded. They didn't come to the wedding. When he died, they didn't come to the funeral either. Quinn was silent. Then, "I'm sorry." She shrugged and pulled the iron from the coals, laying it on the anvil. The hammer felt good in her hand, solid and true. "It's done. Can't change it." "No," he agreed, but it still wasn't right. She glanced at him, surprised by the quiet anger in his voice. He was looking at the ground, his jaw tight. She turned back to the iron and struck it, once and then again, the rhythm of the work settling something in her chest. The summer unfolded in a pattern of fire and iron and brief visits. Quinn came every few days, sometimes with work, and sometimes just to check on a horse he had left with her. He began to time his arrivals for the early morning or late afternoon, when the heat of the day had passed, and she could take a moment to rest. He brought her things: a sack of oats for the horses, a loaf of bread from the baker in his district, a jar of honey one time because she had mentioned her stores were low. She did not know what to make of it. Kindness from humans had always come with an edge of pity or an expectation of something in return. But Quinn asked for nothing. He simply appeared, left whatever he had brought, and stayed long enough to drink a cup of tea or help her move a heavy timber that had been waiting for a second pair of hands. Then he rode away again, the road dust rising behind him. By midsummer, she had 190 silver in her pouch. The debt loomed like a shadow, but for the first time she could see a path through it. If the work continued, if she could pick up a few more clients, if nothing went wrong, she might make it. And then the messenger arrived with the contract. He was a sharp-faced man in a fine coat, riding a horse too good for the rutted track that led to her forge. He dismounted and handed her a folded paper sealed with wax. "From Factor Aldrich Moss. He requires your answer by tomorrow." Elara broke the seal and read. The words swam in front of her eyes. 800 head of cattle to be shod before the autumn drive. The work had to be finished in 6 weeks. Payment on completion: 400 silver, 400 silver, enough to pay the debt and have 100 left over, enough to buy time to rebuild. "Tell him yes," she said. The messenger nodded and rode away. Elara stood in the yard with the contract in her hands and let herself believe, just for a moment, that things might be all right. Quinn arrived 2 days later and found her in the forge, cutting bar stock for the shoes. She had already started the work, rising before dawn to get the fire hot and the iron ready. There were piles of cut stock waiting on the bench and her hands were black with soot. "I heard about the contract," he said. "Word travels fast. It does when it's a job that size." He came to stand beside the anvil, his expression serious. "Elara, that's a hell of a lot of work. Can you manage it alone?" "I have to." She set the cutting hardy aside and wiped her hands on her apron. "It's the only way I'll clear the debt before the first frost." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his face. Then he said, "What if you weren't alone?" "What do you mean?" "I mean I've got 6 weeks before the autumn runs slow down. I can shift my route, get someone to cover the southern leg. I could be here most days." He hesitated and then added, "I'm no farrier, but I can strike iron if you tell me how. I can hold and I can fetch and I can keep the fire going. It's better than nothing." Elara stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because you need help," he said simply. "And because I want to." There was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten, something warm and earnest that she did not have a name for. She wanted to say no, to tell him she could manage on her own as she always had. But the truth was she could not. 800 cattle in 6 weeks was more than one person could do, no matter how fast or how skilled. She would burn herself out trying, and if she failed, she would lose everything. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." They worked together for the first time the next morning. Quinn arrived as the sun was rising, bringing a bedroll and a saddlebag of provisions. He had rearranged his life to be here, and the weight of that settled over her like a cloak. She showed him how to read the iron by color, how to strike where she pointed, how to let the hammer do the work instead of forcing it. He was clumsy at first, his strikes uneven, but he learned quickly and he did not give up. By the end of the first week, they had shod 100 cattle. By the end of the second week, 200. The work was hard and the days were long, stretching from dawn to well past dark. Elara's hands cramped and her shoulders ached, and the heat of the forge turned the air thick and shimmering. But Quinn was always there, steady and patient, doing whatever she asked without complaint. They fell into a rhythm. She would heat the iron and shape it on the anvil, calling out instructions, and he would strike where she directed. When her arm grew too tired to hold the hammer, she would switch to holding and he would shape, his strikes growing surer as the days passed. They did not talk much while they worked. There was no breath for it, but the silence between them was comfortable, almost companionable. In the evenings, when the light grew too dim to see the iron clearly, they would sit outside the forge and eat whatever simple meal she had prepared. Quinn would check the horses and make sure the forge was banked safely for the night. Sometimes he would tell her stories from the road, wild colts he had broken, narrow escapes from summer storms, the strange people he met on his route. She found herself laughing at his dry delivery, the way he made even the most ordinary events sound faintly absurd. And sometimes she would tell him things she had not spoken aloud in years, about the foundling house and the strict, cold woman who had run it, about her apprenticeship and the small, fierce pride she had felt the first time she shaped a perfect shoe, about Garrett, who had been kind and gentle and who had made her feel for a few short years like she belonged somewhere. "Do you miss him?" Quinn asked one night. They were sitting on the bench outside the forge, the sky overhead thick with stars. His voice was quiet, careful. "Yes," she said. "Not the way I did at first. That was like a wound. This is more like an empty space. I miss having someone who knew me, who saw me." Quinn was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I see you." Her breath caught. She turned to look at him and found him watching her, his expression open and unguarded in the dim light. There was no pity in his face, no hesitation, just a steady, quiet certainty that made something in her chest crack open. "Quinn," she started, but she did not know what to say, how to name the feeling that was rising in her like a tide. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just wanted you to know." They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, while the night settled around them. The work continued. 300 cattle shod, 400, 500. Elara's body ached in ways she had not thought possible, every muscle screaming by the end of each day. But she did not stop. She could not afford to, and then, in the 5th week, disaster struck. She was working alone. Quinn had ridden to the next district to pick up more bar stock from the iron merchant when the factor's clerk arrived. He was a thin man with a weasel's face, and he carried an air of self-importance that made Elara's skin prickle. "Just checking on the progress," he said, wandering around the forge with his hands behind his back. "Factor Moss wants to be sure you'll meet the deadline." "I'll meet it," Elara said curtly. She did not trust the way he was looking at her tools, his gaze lingering on the tire and the bellows. "Good, good." He paused beside the coal pile and prodded it with his boot. "Seems like you're running low. That's a shame. Coal's hard to come by this time of year. I have enough." "Do you?" He smiled, thin and cold. "Well, I'm sure you know best." He left shortly after, and Elara went back to work. But that night, when she went to stoke the fire, she found the coal damp and heavy, mixed through with dirt and stones. And when she tried to build the heat for the next day's work, the tire cracked with a sound like a gunshot, splitting down the middle. She stood staring at the broken pipe, her hands shaking. The tire was the heart of the forge, the tube that fed air to the fire. Without it, she could not get the iron hot enough to shape, and a replacement would take days to find, perhaps longer. Days she did not have. Quinn found her sitting on the floor of the forge, her head in her hands. He took one look at the tire and his face went hard. "That wasn't an accident," he said. "No." Her voice was dull. "The coal's been tampered with too. It's all damp. I think he watered it." Quinn swore, low and vicious. "The clerk, it has to be. Moss must have decided he doesn't want to pay out the contract. If you fail, he keeps the fee and finds someone cheaper." "I know." She looked up at him, and the despair in her chest was a living thing. "I can't finish without the tire. I can't get a new one in time." "Then we'll make one." She shook her head. "Quinn, I don't have the tools for that. I don't have the metal. We'll figure it out." He crouched in front of her and took her hands, his grip firm and grounding. "Elara, listen to me. You are the best farrier I've ever met. If anyone can do this, it's you, but you're not doing it alone. Do you understand? We'll find a way." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that will and determination could overcome the sabotage, the bad luck, the weight of everything pressing down on her. But the words stuck in her throat. That night, when the fire was banked and Quinn had gone to check the horses, she stood in the doorway of the forge and looked out at the dark yard. The debt notice was still nailed to the doorframe, a silent reminder of everything she stood to lose. She reached up and touched the scar on her cheek, the rough tissue a map of old pain. "No man would ever want me," she whispered. The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, as if she were stating the weather. It was not self-pity. It was simply the truth as she knew it. She was an orc woman, scarred and marked by tragedy, carrying a dead man's debts. What could she offer anyone? Then every man is blind. She spun around. Quinn was standing at the edge of the light, his face half in shadow. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and she saw that his expression was fierce and tender all at once. "Elara," he said, and his voice was rough. "If you think for 1 second that you're not worth wanting, you're wrong. You're strong and skilled, and you don't give up even when the whole world is trying to grind you down. You're kind without making a show of it. You love what you do, and it shows in every piece of work you touch." He paused and then added more quietly, "And when you smile, really smile, it's like the sun coming out." Her breath caught. She could not look away from him, from the honesty burning in his eyes. "Quinn, I'm not saying this to make you feel better," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true. I've spent the last 2 months finding excuses to ride this road just so I could see you. I rearranged my whole life to be here because the thought of you struggling alone was unbearable. He stopped, exhaled, and then said, "I love you. I've loved you for weeks now, maybe longer. And I don't care that you're an orc or that you're a widow or that you have a scar. I care that you're you, and that's more than enough." Elara's eyes burned. She had not cried since Garrett died, had not let herself, but now the tears came hot and fierce, and she could not stop them. Quinn pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face against his shoulder, her hands fisting in his shirt. He held her while she shook, his hand gentle on her back, and he did not say anything more. He did not need to. When she finally pulled away, her face wet and her chest aching, she looked up at him and said, "I love you too." His smile was slow and bright, like dawn breaking. He cupped her face in his hands, careful of the scar, and kissed her. It was soft and sweet and tasted like promise. And for the first time in 2 years, Elara felt something like hope. They worked through the night. Quinn rode to the neighboring farms and came back with scraps of iron and a length of copper pipe that someone had been using as a fence post. Elara heated and hammered and shaped, her hands moving with a desperate precision. By dawn she had fashioned a makeshift tire that would hold long enough to finish the job. It was rough and ugly, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. They started the fire and went back to work. 500 cattle became 600. 600 became 700. Elara's hands were blistered and raw, her shoulders screaming, but she did not stop. Quinn struck the iron and held the animals and kept the fire fed, his face set with determination. And then, in the final week, her hand slipped. She was shaping a shoe, her attention fixed on the curve of the iron, when the hammer glanced off the edge and struck her right hand. Pain exploded up her arm, white-hot and blinding. She dropped the hammer and staggered back, clutching her wrist. Quinn was beside her in an instant. He took her hand gently and she hissed as he turned it over. The skin across her knuckles was already swelling, the flesh dark and angry. "It's not broken," he said, his voice tight. "But you can't work with it, not for a few days at least." "I don't have a few days." Her voice was shaking. "We have 150 cattle left and 5 days to finish. I can't—" "Yes, you can." He met her eyes, steady and certain. "You're going to stand at the anvil and tell me exactly what to do, and I'm going to do it. You'll hold with your left hand when you can. We'll manage." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him it was impossible, that he did not have the skill, that they would fail. But the look on his face stopped her. He believed they could do this, and his belief was a lifeline she could not let go of. They wrapped her hand in linen and went back to work. Elara stood at the anvil and directed, her voice hoarse from shouting instructions over the ring of the hammer. Quinn struck where she told him, heating and shaping and fitting the shoes with a care that bordered on reverence. He made mistakes, shoes that were too thin or too thick, nails that bent instead of driving true, but he corrected them and kept going. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, standing by and watching someone else do the work her hands ached to perform. But it was also a strange kind of trust, a letting go she had not known she needed. Quinn was not Garrett. He did not move the same way, did not think the same way. But he was here and he was trying, and that was enough. On the morning of the 6th day, they shod the last cow. Elara checked the hoof, running her unbandaged fingers over the nails, and nodded. "It's good. We're done." Quinn set down the hammer and leaned against the anvil, his face gray with exhaustion. "We did it. We did." She looked at him, at the soot on his face and the burns on his arms and the stubborn set of his jaw, and felt something fierce and tender swell in her chest. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "We did this together." The factor's clerk arrived the next day to inspect the work. He walked through the herd with a sour expression, checking hooves and looking for any excuse to reject the job. But the work was sound, and in the end he could find no fault. He handed over the payment with obvious reluctance and rode away without a word. Elara counted the silver twice to be sure. 400 coins, bright and heavy in her hands. She added it to the pouch under her mattress and took out 300, wrapping them in a cloth. Then she and Quinn rode to the district office and paid the debt in full. The clerk stamped the receipt and handed it to her with a bored expression. "Property's clear. You're free to go, free." The word echoed in her mind as they rode back to the forge. Free of debt. Free of the shadow that had hung over her for 2 years. Free to breathe. That night they sat outside the forge and watched the stars come out. Elara's hand was still wrapped in linen, but the swelling had gone down and she could move her fingers again. Quinn's arm was around her shoulders and she leaned into him, bone-tired and content. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he looked down at her, his expression thoughtful. "Now we figure out what comes next, together if you'll have me." She tilted her head to look at him. "Are you asking me something, Quinn Ironwood?" A slow smile spread across his face. "I suppose I am. Elara Stoneforge, will you marry me?" Her heart kicked in her chest. She thought of Garrett, kind and gentle, who had given her a home and a name. She thought of the years she had spent alone, believing that part of her life was finished. And she thought of Quinn, who had ridden into her life with 30 horses and stayed because he chose to, who had worked beside her and believed in her and loved her without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." They were married in the autumn, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp. The ceremony was small, just the two of them and a priest from the village, standing in the yard of the forge with the horses watching from the paddock. Elara wore a simple dress the color of cream, and Quinn wore his best coat, brushed clean of road dust. He slipped a ring onto her finger, a band of iron he had shaped himself under her direction, and she gave him one in return. Afterwards, they held a small gathering. A few neighbors came, people who had slowly begun to bring Elara their work again now that she had proven herself. The baker from Quinn's district came, and the iron merchant, and the priest who had married them. They ate bread and cheese and drank cider, and someone played a fiddle while the sun sank low. Elara stood at the edge of the gathering, watching Quinn laugh at something the baker said, and felt a deep, quiet happiness settle in her bones. She had not thought she would have this again, a partner, a future, a life that felt like more than just survival. Quinn caught her eye and smiled, and she smiled back. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in late autumn and piling deep by midwinter. The forge stayed busy. Farmers and drovers needed shoes and tools, and word had spread that Elara Stoneforge did good work and did not overcharge. Quinn adjusted his route, so he was home more often than not, picking up work as a horse breaker in the district when the post run slowed. They worked together as they had during the cattle drive, though now the urgency was gone and they could take their time. Quinn learned to shape iron with increasing skill, and Elara taught him the subtleties of the craft: how to read an animal's gait, how to adjust a shoe for balance, how to know when a hoof needed rest instead of iron. He would never be a master farrier, but he was steady and capable, and that was more than enough. In the evenings they would sit by the fire in the house Garrett had built, the one Elara had nearly lost. Quinn would read aloud from whatever book he had borrowed from the village, his voice low and soothing, while Elara mended harness or oiled tools. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, her head on his shoulder, listening to the wind howl outside. One night, as the snow fell thick and soft beyond the window, Quinn looked up from his book and said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the forge, about putting both our names on it, officially." Elara set down the strap she was working on and looked at him. "You want to be a partner in the business. I want to be your partner in everything," he said simply. "This place is as much mine now as it is yours. I think the work should reflect that." She considered it. The forge had been Garrett's dream, and then his legacy, and then her burden. But it was something else now, something she and Quinn had built together, piece by piece, through sweat and fire and stubborn determination. It felt right to share it, to make it truly theirs. "All right," she said. "We'll do it." They rode to the district office the next week and registered the forge under both their names: Stoneforge and Ironwood, farriers and smiths. The clerk made a note in the ledger, and that was that. Simple and official, and exactly what they needed. Spring came slowly, the snow melting into mud and then into the first green shoots of new growth. Elara's hand had healed completely, the scar tissue tough and flexible. She could work as she always had, though now she did not have to. Quinn was there to share the load, and together they were faster and more efficient than she had ever been alone. The district noticed. Work came in steadily horses and cattle, and the occasional wagon that needed a new rim or a cracked axle repaired. They hired a young apprentice, a human boy from the village who was quick with his hands and eager to learn. Elara taught him as she had been taught, with patience and precision, and he soaked up the knowledge like a sponge. By summer, the forge was thriving. They had enough work to keep 3 people busy and enough silver saved that Elara could breathe without the constant weight of worry. She bought new tools, good ones that would last, and Quinn built a second paddock for the horses they boarded. One evening in late summer, as they were closing up the forge for the night, Quinn said, "There's a horse fair in the valley next month. Big one with buyers from all over. I thought we might go." "To sell?" Elara asked. "To show what we can do." He gestured to the forge, to the neat rows of tools and the horses in the paddock. "We've built something here, Elara. People should know about it." She thought about it. The idea of standing in front of strangers, of presenting her work to be judged, made her nervous. But it was also a chance to prove herself, to show that an orc farrier could do work as fine as any humans. "All right," she said. "Let's do it." The fair was held in a wide meadow near the river, with tents and stalls stretching as far as the eye could see. There were horses everywhere, sleek thoroughbreds and sturdy plow horses, wild-eyed colts and gentle mares. Traders and buyers moved through the crowd, inspecting animals and haggling over prices. Elara and Quinn set up a small display near the edge of the fairgrounds. They brought examples of their work shoes of different sizes and styles, a set of decorative hinges Quinn had made, a collection of tools Elara had forged. And they brought their own horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding they had bought in the spring and shod with particular care. People stopped to look, some curious and some skeptical. A few made comments about her green skin, about the unusual partnership, about whether an orc could really be trusted with such delicate work. Elara ignored them. She had spent too long proving herself to care what strangers thought. And then a grizzled old horseman stopped at their stall and picked up one of the shoes. He turned it over in his hands, examining the nail holes and the curve of the iron, and then looked at Elara with sharp, assessing eyes. "You make this?" he asked. "I did." He grunted and set it down, then moved to the gelding and picked up one of its hooves. He studied the shoe for a long moment, running his thumb over the nails, and then set the hoof down gently. "That's fine work," he said. "Best I've seen in years. You take commissions?" Elara's heart leaped. "I do." "Good. I've got a string of carriage horses need shoeing before the winter, 12 of them. I'll pay fair rates and cover your travel if you'll come to my estate." "I'll come," she said. He nodded and handed her a card with his name and address. "I'll expect you in a month, don't be late." He walked away, and Elara stood holding the card, her hands trembling slightly. Quinn put his arm around her shoulders and squeezed gently. "See," he said. "I told you people would notice." By the end of the fair, they had 3 more commissions and a standing offer to supply shoes to a cavalry unit stationed in the next province. It was more work than they had ever had, more than Elara had dreamed possible. That evening, as they packed up their display and prepared to head home, Quinn pulled a small bundle from his saddlebag. "I made something," he said. "For us." He unwrapped the cloth and held out a steel stamp, the kind used to mark a maker's work. It was beautifully made, the surface engraved with 2 symbols intertwined, a hammer and a horseshoe, surrounded by a circle. "It's both of us," he said. "Your hammer and my horses. I thought we could use it to mark the shoes we make together." Elara took the stamp and turned it over in her hands, her throat tight. It was perfect, a symbol of everything they had built, everything they had become. 2 people, 2 lives forged into one. "It's beautiful," she said. Thank you. They went home as the sun set, the sky streaked with orange and gold. The forge was waiting, solid and familiar, and the horses nickered a greeting as they rode into the yard. Elara stabled the gelding while Quinn carried their things inside, and then they stood together in the forge, the familiar smell of coal and iron and leather surrounding them. Quinn handed her the stamp, and she heated a nail on the coals, watching the metal glow. When it was hot enough, she set the stamp against it and struck once, hard and true. The symbols impressed into the metal, clear and sharp, and she held it up to the light. There, she said. Now it's official. Quinn smiled and kissed her, his hands warm on her waist. Now it's official. The winter came and went, and the spring after that, and the seasons turned in their endless cycle. The forge prospered. The apprentice grew skilled and eventually took on commissions of his own, working under Elara's guidance. Quinn's reputation as a horse breaker spread, and people began to bring him their most difficult animals, trusting him to gentle them without breaking their spirits. And Elara found that the scar on her face had stopped feeling like a mark of tragedy and started feeling like a part of her story. People saw it and knew she had survived something hard, and that was enough. One evening in the second spring of their marriage, as they sat outside the forge watching the stars, Quinn said, "Do you ever think about children?" Elara turned to look at him, surprised. They had never spoken of it, though the thought had crossed her mind more than once. "Sometimes," she said. "Do you?" "I do." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think you'd be a good mother, patient and strong and kind." "And you'd be a good father," she said. "You have a way with small, stubborn creatures," he laughed, the sound warm and fond. "Is that what our children would be?" "Small and stubborn, probably," she said and smiled. "If they take after either of us." They tried, and in the autumn Elara found herself expecting. The pregnancy was not easy. She was sick in the mornings and tired in the evenings, but Quinn was patient and attentive, taking on more of the forge work so she could rest. The apprentice stepped up as well, proving himself capable and reliable. Their son was born in the late spring, small and squalling and perfect. They named him Isaac, and he had Quinn's dark hair and Elara's green skin, and the tiny tusks of his orc heritage. Quinn held him with a kind of awed tenderness, his large hands cradling the baby as if he were made of glass. "He's beautiful," Quinn said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "He is," Elara agreed. She was exhausted, her body aching, but the sight of her husband holding their son filled her with a fierce, overwhelming joy. Isaac grew quickly, a bright and curious child who toddled after them around the forge and laughed at the horses. When he was old enough to understand, Elara taught him the names of the tools, and Quinn taught him how to approach an animal without spooking it. He was too young to work, but he watched everything with wide, interested eyes, and Elara knew that one day he would be a fine craftsman. 2 years later, a daughter followed. They named her Bella, and she had Elara's eyes and Quinn's stubborn jaw. She was louder than Isaac had been, demanding attention and affection in equal measure, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny finger with ease. The forge was loud now, filled with the sounds of children and horses and the ring of hammer on anvil. It was chaotic and exhausting, and more than Elara had ever thought she would have. But it was theirs, and she would not have traded it for anything. One evening, when the children were asleep and the forge was quiet, Elara and Quinn stood together in the yard and looked up at the stars. She leaned against him, his arms solid around her shoulders, and thought about how far she had come. From the frightened widow with a debt notice on her door to this a thriving business, a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, and a future that stretched out bright and full of promise. "Do you ever regret it?" Quinn asked quietly. Marrying me, I mean. Taking on all of this. She thought about the question. It would have been easy to say no, to brush it aside. But she knew he was asking something deeper, whether the life they had built together was enough, whether she was happy. No, she said, and meant it. I don't regret a single moment. You gave me a reason to hope again, Quinn. You saw me when no one else did. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. How could I regret that? He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her temple. I love you, he said. I always will. I love you too. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other in the quiet night, and when they finally went inside, the house was warm and the children were sleeping and everything was exactly as it should be. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family and the slow, steady building of a life. The forge continued to prosper, and Elara's reputation spread far beyond the district. She became known as one of the finest farriers in the region, sought after for her skill and her fair prices. Quinn worked beside her, his hands as sure with iron now as they were with horses, and together they trained a succession of apprentices who carried their methods to other forges. Isaac grew tall and serious, with his father's quiet determination and his mother's eye for detail. Bella was bright and bold, always asking questions and poking into things she was not supposed to touch. They were different in every way, but they loved each other fiercely, the way siblings do. When Isaac was 8 and Bella was 6, Elara took them to the winter horse fair. It was the same fair where she and Quinn had first shown their work, and it had become a tradition to attend every year. The children ran through the fairgrounds with the freedom of the young, marveling at the horses and the acrobats and the merchants selling sweets. Elara and Quinn walked hand in hand, their steps slow and easy. They stopped at their usual spot near the edge of the grounds and set up a small display, more out of habit than necessity. They had more work than they could handle, but the fair was a chance to see old friends and catch up on the news of the region. As the sun climbed high, a young orc woman approached their stall. She was small and thin, with nervous eyes and a bruise on her jaw. She looked at the display for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "Is it true you're an orc farrier?" Elara straightened. "I am." "And you make a living at it? People bring you work?" "They do." Elara studied the young woman, recognizing the uncertainty in her posture, the way she held herself as if expecting to be turned away. "Are you looking for an apprenticeship?" The young woman's eyes went wide. I don't know. I didn't think anyone would take me. I'm good with my hands and I've done some metalwork, but I'm an orc," Elara finished gently. "Yes, so am I, and I'm telling you it's possible. It's not easy and people will doubt you, but if you're skilled and determined, you can make a place for yourself. Do you want to learn?" The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "I do." "Then come to my forge in the spring," Elara said. She gave the woman directions and her name and watched as she walked away, her steps a little lighter than before. Quinn put his arm around her shoulders. "That was kind of you." "It was necessary," Elara said. "Someone gave me a chance once. I can do the same." They stayed at the fair until the sun began to sink, and then they gathered the children and headed home. The road was familiar now, worn smooth by years of travel, and the forge came into view as the last light faded from the sky. It looked exactly as it had the first time Quinn rode into the yard with 30 horses, solid and welcoming, a place where good work was done. But it was more than that now. It was home, not just for her, but for all of them. That night, after the children were in bed, Elara went to the forge and lit a single candle. She took out the maker's stamp, the one Quinn had made with both their symbols intertwined, and held it up to the light. The metal was worn now, smooth from years of use, but the symbols were still clear. Quinn came to stand beside her. "What are you thinking about?" "About everything," she said. "About how different my life is now than it was 5 years ago. About how close I came to losing all of this." "But you didn't lose it," he said. "You fought for it. We fought for it. We did." She set the stamp down and turned to face him. "I don't say it enough, but thank you for everything, for seeing me, for believing in me, for building this life with me." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gentle on her cheekbones. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "Loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done." She kissed him, slow and deep, and the warmth of it spread through her like sunlight. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and breathed him in the smell of leather and horse and iron that was as familiar as her own skin. "Come on," she said. "Let's go to bed." They walked back to the house together, the forge dark and quiet behind them. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over her that night when she had whispered her despair into the darkness, and Quinn had answered with love. She had been wrong that night. Men did want her, or at least one man did, and he was the only one who mattered. He had seen past the green skin and the tusks and the scar to the woman beneath, and he had chosen her. Not out of pity or obligation, but because he loved her, and she loved him. Fiercely and completely, with the kind of love that was forged in fire and tempered by hardship. The kind of love that lasted. They climbed into bed, the blankets soft and warm, and Quinn pulled her close. She tucked herself against his side, her head on his shoulder, and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Good night, Elara," he murmured. "Good night, Quinn." She closed her eyes and let herself drift, safe and loved and home at last. The forge would be there in the morning, waiting for them. The work would continue, the seasons would turn, and life would unfold in all its messy, beautiful complexity. But for now, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be, and that was more than enough.